Sarah Connor.
A nuclear explosion tears across the world, showing the future John Connor has feared his entire life. Humanity has been nearly wiped out, and machines now dominate the battlefield. Flying war machines patrol the ruins, while Terminators hunt down the remaining survivors. Years after Judgment Day was supposedly prevented, John still refuses to believe the danger is over. He lives completely off the grid, taking temporary jobs, avoiding phones, credit cards, and official records. With no permanent home, he keeps moving, hoping the machines can never find him. But nightmares of the future continue to follow him. After waking from another restless night, John gets back on his motorcycle. His trip ends suddenly when an animal crosses the road, causing him to crash. Elsewhere, a burst of electricity marks the arrival of another traveler from the future. A naked woman appears and quickly kills someone nearby, taking her clothes and vehicle. Once inside the car, she accesses a list of people marked for elimination. When police stop her for running a traffic light, she calmly studies the officer and his weapon. She is no ordinary killer. She is the TX, an advanced Terminator built to hunt and destroy specific targets. The next morning, Kate Brewster spends time with her fiancé when her father calls. Kate had hoped Robert Brewster would finally meet him properly, but Robert is once again too busy with his military work. Kate is disappointed, but his position keeps him constantly occupied. At the same time, another electrical disturbance appears elsewhere in the city. A second Terminator has arrived. Still injured from his crash, John gets dropped off near a veterinary clinic. He refuses to visit a hospital because it could place his name back into official records. Instead, he breaks into the clinic and searches for pain medication. Meanwhile, the newly arrived Terminator walks naked into a crowded bar. Ignoring the reactions around him, he scans the room, chooses a man with suitable clothes, and orders him to hand them over. After getting dressed, he tries on a pair of flashy sunglasses, immediately rejects them and crushes them. He then steals a vehicle, finds a better pair inside, and drives away. The TX has already started eliminating people from her list. She finds one target working at a drive-through restaurant and kills them after confirming their identity. She then heads to a house party, where she tracks down and eliminates several more names without hesitation. Back at the clinic, John takes the medicine and eventually passes out. Later, Kate arrives after receiving an emergency call about an animal. Inside, she notices an empty medicine container and realizes someone has broken in. John wakes up and pulls a gun on her, warning her not to call the police. He explains that he only came for medication because he cannot risk going to a hospital. Kate checks what he swallowed and tells him the drugs are meant for animals. Before John can react, Kate attacks him, gains the advantage, and locks him inside an animal cage. A client soon arrives with a pet. Kate leaves John trapped while she handles the situation, then returns to question him. When he gives his name, Kate recognizes it, John Connor. She suddenly remembers that they knew each other as children and attended the same school. Their unexpected reunion is cut short when someone else enters the clinic. Kate goes to investigate and discovers the TX, who quickly attacks the visitor. Realizing the woman is dangerous, Kate hides while the machine searches the building. During the search, the TX finds a blood-stained bandage. She analyzes the sample and identifies the blood as John Connor's. John had stayed hidden because he had erased himself from official systems. Now the TX knows he is nearby. Kate tries to escape, but another figure suddenly appears. The newly arrived Terminator grabs her and demands to know where John Connor is. Before Kate can respond, a vehicle crashes into the area, causing a violent explosion. The Terminator emerges from the wreckage. He is a T-850. He takes Kate and continues questioning her about John, before locking her inside a storage compartment so she cannot interfere. John manages to escape from the cage. While moving through the damaged clinic, he spots part of the TX and instantly realizes that a Terminator is involved. He runs, but the T-850 catches him and forces him into a vehicle. The TX appears moments later. The T-850 shoots her repeatedly, but the bullets barely slow her down. Realizing a direct fight will not stop her, he gets John away from the clinic. Police race toward the destruction as John and the Terminator escape. Kate, still trapped inside the vehicle, manages to contact emergency services and report that she has been kidnapped, but the call cuts off before she can give enough information. The TX switches tactics. She takes control of a large truck and remotely hijacks nearby vehicles, sending cars moving wildly through the streets. The T-850 steals a motorcycle and continues the pursuit. John is caught in the middle of the chaos with Kate still trapped inside his vehicle. While trying to escape, he crashes into another car. The angry driver gets out and blocks him from leaving. John desperately tries to restart the vehicle, but the engine refuses to cooperate. The T-850 suddenly arrives, and the angry driver confronting John immediately backs away. John finally gets the car started and speeds off. Behind him, the TX keeps forcing her truck through traffic, sending cars crashing in every direction. Police units join the pursuit and try to force John off the road, making the situation even worse. The TX closes in and transforms her arm into a weapon. She fires, causing another explosion across the street. The T-850 races beside her truck on a motorcycle, doing everything he can to keep her away from John. The TX responds by swinging the truck's massive crane through the road. Cars, signs, and structures are smashed apart as she clears a path. The T-850 fires at the truck's tires, damaging them, but she quickly turns the crane on him. He is struck and thrown across the roadway, but manages to keep going. John continues trying to escape the police while the TX attacks again. She catches the T-850 with the crane and smashes him into the side of a building, sending concrete and glass everywhere. A short time later, the T-850 crashes into a fire truck and immediately takes control of it. He races back into the pursuit and drives straight into the TX's truck. The collision causes another violent wreck. The T-850 manages to throw the TX from the vehicle, but she catches hold of the outside before falling away. He flips the truck to shake her loose, finally separating himself from her. He then reaches John and climbs into his vehicle. Behind them, the TX slowly rises from the burning wreckage and watches them escape. Once they are clear, the T-850 grabs John's face and checks his eyes. After examining him, he determines that John is not seriously injured. John has had enough. He demands answers. He believed Judgment Day had been stopped years ago. Now another Terminator has appeared, another machine has been sent to protect him, and the future he tried to escape seems to be happening anyway. Kate is still locked in the back, shouting and demanding to be released, while John and the T-850 discuss Judgment Day, Skynet, and John's future role as leader of the human resistance. John hates hearing it again. He has spent years avoiding that destiny, only to find himself being pulled straight back into it. During the drive, the T-850 asks John for a knife. John gives it to him, then watches as the machine cuts open his own damaged flesh. Metal is visible underneath. The T-850 removes a damaged internal component and explains that the TX is a much more advanced model. She is faster, stronger, and specifically designed to destroy other Terminators. John immediately asks how they are supposed to beat something more powerful than him. The T-850 gives him no comforting answer. Instead, he throws the damaged component onto the road. Seconds later, it explodes behind them. Eventually, they stop at a gas station for supplies. The T-850 walks inside and begins collecting food, equipment, and anything else he considers useful. He also finds another pair of sunglasses and takes them. The store owner becomes suspicious when the Terminator appears ready to leave with a large amount of merchandise. Outside, Kate gets another chance to resist. As soon as the compartment is opened, she attacks the T-850 and screams for help. The commotion gets the store owner's attention, and he tries to contact the authorities. John attempts to calm Kate and explain what is happening. From her point of view, none of it makes sense. A man she barely remembers has abducted her, with a giant stranger claiming to be a machine from the future. The T-850 confirms exactly that and tells her about what is coming. Kate refuses to believe him. John tries to explain that the situation is much larger than any of them. According to everything he has been told, he is supposed to survive Judgment Day and eventually lead humanity against the machines. Even John struggles to accept that future. As they continue traveling, things become slightly calmer. John and Kate talk about their childhood and slowly remember how they knew each other years earlier. While they reconnect, the TX continues hunting. She reaches Kate's home, where Kate's fiancé, Scott, is waiting. He barely has time to react before the TX kills him. Later, police arrive at the house looking for Kate. Someone who appears to be Scott answers the door and speaks with them, but Scott is already dead. The TX has copied his appearance. The officers tell the fake Scott that Kate has been located and is safe. Without realizing it, they reveal exactly where the TX needs to go. Meanwhile, the T-850 takes John and Kate to another location and forces them out of the vehicle. He leads them into a building where John suddenly notices a familiar name on a tombstone, Sarah Connor. John is stunned. He had never known his mother was buried there. The T-850 opens Sarah's coffin, but there is no body inside. Instead, it is filled with weapons. He explains that Sarah was cremated and her ashes were scattered somewhere else. Before dying, however, she arranged for weapons to be hidden in case Judgment Day still happened. John quietly takes in what his mother had done. Even after everything they went through, Sarah had never completely stopped preparing for the future. Kate notices how deeply the discovery affects him. Then she sees one of the weapons. Kate grabs it and aims directly at the T-850. He calmly walks toward her. She fires. The bullet hits him in the face, but he barely reacts. A moment later, he spits out the flattened round. Kate stares at him in shock. For the first time, John's story becomes impossible to dismiss. Before she can recover, gas canisters suddenly fly into the building. Police and SWAT teams have surrounded the area. Kate runs outside and is immediately taken by the officers. Inside, the T-850 begins preparing weapons. John becomes alarmed, knowing how easily a Terminator could kill the police outside. He desperately tries to stop him from opening fire on everyone. The T-850 suddenly grabs John by the throat and lifts him off the ground. John becomes furious and fights back. The Terminator releases him and tells him to remember that feeling. If John wants to survive what is coming, he needs to use that same determination to keep himself alive. Elsewhere, the officers who spoke to the person they believe is Scott report that Kate has been found. That is all the TX needs. She kills them, drops Scott's appearance, and reveals her true form. Then she turns around and heads directly toward Kate. At the cemetery, Kate is questioned by Dr. Silberman. Still terrified, she tells him the man inside the building is not human. She watched him take a bullet to the face and remain standing. Silberman assumes the shock of the situation has affected her memory and tries to explain it as stress. Then the SWAT team moves in. The doors suddenly open, and the T-850 walks outside carrying Sarah Connor's coffin. Officers immediately open fire, but the bullets barely slow him down. Silberman sees the Terminator and instantly recognizes that something impossible is happening again. The T-850 raises a heavy machine gun and fires across the area, destroying vehicles and equipment while deliberately avoiding killing the officers. Once he clears a path, he loads the coffin into a vehicle. Then John climbs out from inside it. The coffin had been used to hide him during the escape. John and the T-850 steal a vehicle and prepare to leave. Nearby, Kate suddenly sees Scott approaching and moves toward him, but something about him feels wrong. A moment later, Scott's appearance begins changing. It is the TX. Before she can reach Kate, the T-850 arrives and fires a rocket launcher. The blast throws the TX away, giving them enough time to grab Kate and escape. The TX quickly recovers and resumes the chase. By now, Kate no longer doubts John's story. She has seen the machines herself and knows the threat is real. The TX catches their moving vehicle and jumps onto it. Her arm transforms into a cutting tool, and she begins slicing through the roof. The T-850 swerves violently, trying to throw her off, but she keeps holding on. John fires at her through the opening. Eventually, their vehicle crashes through an obstacle that tears away part of the roof and knocks the TX loose. They continue driving while she is left behind. The TX gets back up, inspects the damage to her arm, and angrily burns a nearby tree before continuing her pursuit. Later, John, Kate, and the T-850 stop and take shelter inside a caravan. For the first time since the nightmare began, Kate has a moment to process Scott's death. She breaks down, overwhelmed by how completely her life has changed in only a few hours. John sits beside her and tries to comfort her. Later, he speaks privately with the T-850 and learns something completely unexpected. In the future, John and Kate become husband and wife. John can hardly believe it. Kate overhears part of the conversation, and when her father is mentioned, she immediately starts listening more closely. The T-850 explains that Robert Brewster's work is directly connected to Skynet. John now understands why Kate became part of the TX's mission. Kate insists they find her father. If Robert is involved with Skynet, he may be in danger and could possibly prevent the disaster. The T-850 refuses. His mission is only to keep John and Kate alive. Then he reveals how little time remains. Judgment Day is only 3 hours away. Once it begins, nuclear weapons will be launched, so his plan is to move John and Kate far from the danger zone. John refuses to leave Robert behind. He points a gun at the Terminator and argues that saving Kate's father could be their best chance to stop the future. Protecting him means nothing if the world is destroyed anyway. The T-850 walks toward him without fear. After a tense moment, he changes course and agrees to help. John and Kate are relieved. They continue toward the military facility, while John prepares weapons and equipment inside the caravan. During the drive, Kate asks more questions about the future. The T-850 explains that she eventually becomes John's wife and also serves as his second-in-command in the Resistance. Kate is stunned by the idea. Then the conversation turns much darker. The Terminator reveals that John eventually dies. John asks who kills him. The answer is simple. The T-850 does. John and Kate are left speechless. Meanwhile, Robert Brewster is facing a growing crisis at the military facility. A computer virus is spreading through satellite systems and communications networks, and no one can figure out how to stop it. The Pentagon is already involved, and pressure on Robert is increasing. Inside the facility are advanced unmanned aircraft and other experimental military machines connected to the technology under his control. Back in the caravan, John is still trying to understand how the same machine protecting him could later become his killer. He and Kate continue talking, comparing what they know about the future and their past. For a short time, the tension between them eases, and their old connection begins to grow stronger. The Terminator soon interrupts and brings their attention back to the mission. At the military base, the virus keeps spreading. Officials push Robert to activate Skynet, believing the system may be powerful enough to eliminate the infection. Robert is hesitant because Skynet would gain control over major military networks once activated. But the situation is getting worse by the minute. Unknown to everyone, the TX has already entered the facility. She moves through restricted areas and begins reprogramming the advanced military machines stored inside. One after another, the weapon systems fall under her control. With pressure from the Pentagon continuing to rise, Robert finally makes the decision. He activates Skynet. At first, it seems like the system may work. Then everything starts failing. Screens flicker, networks stop responding, and military systems begin acting on their own. Skynet is not destroying the virus. Skynet is taking control. Judgment Day has begun. Moments later, Kate appears inside the facility. Before Robert can react, the T-850 shoots her. Everyone freezes. Then the injured figure changes form. It was never Kate. The TX had copied her appearance. The real Kate is still alive. The T-850 opens fire and knocks the TX back, but Robert is wounded during the attack. Kate rushes to her father's side and tries to help him as his condition worsens. At the same time, the military machines previously reprogrammed by the TX activate throughout the facility. Automated weapons begin firing. Robotic units move through the corridors and attack the personnel around them. The military base quickly turns into a battlefield as people are hunted by their own machines. John, Kate, and the T-850 realize they need to act fast. John, Kate, and the T-850 make their way through the facility while avoiding the machines now attacking anyone they detect. When armed robots approach, the group takes cover. The T-850 steps out and destroys them, clearing the way toward Robert's office. They soon find Robert badly wounded. With little time left, he explains the truth about Skynet. There is no single computer they can simply shut down. Skynet has spread across connected systems everywhere. The virus the military had been fighting was actually Skynet itself. Activating the system did not stop the threat. It gave Skynet complete control. Robert tells them about another secure location that may still be important. If they have any chance left, they need to go there. Kate stays beside her father as his condition worsens, struggling to accept that she is losing him. Before they can remain there any longer, an automated aircraft attacks the facility. Explosions rip through the building, forcing everyone to move. Then the TX appears. The T-850 immediately confronts her. The two machines crash into each other with enormous force, smashing through equipment and walls while John and Kate run for safety. The T-850 fights with raw strength, but the TX quickly proves more advanced. She is faster, better armed, and able to adapt to every attack. Their fight carries them through the building until they crash through part of the structure. The TX burns away part of the T-850's facial covering, exposing the metal underneath. Then she twists his head and neck violently, leaving him collapsed and apparently disabled. John and Kate keep moving. Another automated machine blocks their route and opens fire. They dive behind cover. This time Kate grabs a weapon and fights back herself. She fires repeatedly until the machine is destroyed. The two finally reach a laboratory, but the TX is still following them. John and Kate quickly use the equipment around them to create a powerful magnetic field. When the TX enters, the magnetic force pulls her toward the machinery and traps her against it. Her body begins coming apart under the pressure. Kate screams at her to die while John watches the machine struggle. Believing they have finally stopped her, they run. Elsewhere, the T-850 comes back online. His neck is still badly twisted, but his systems begin functioning again. He forces his head back into position and restores enough movement to continue. The TX also survives. Still caught in the magnetic field, she uses a cutting tool built into her body to free herself. John and Kate reach a small aircraft and prepare to leave. Then they see the T-850 walking toward them. At first they are relieved, but instead of helping, he attacks John. Kate jumps on him, trying to stop the assault, but the Terminator throws her aside and turns back toward John. John realizes what happened. During their fight, the TX must have corrupted the T-850's programming and ordered him to kill John. Knowing he cannot overpower the machine, John tries to reach the part of its programming that still recognizes its original mission. He asks the Terminator what he was sent to do. The T-850 answers that his mission is to protect John Connor and Kate Brewster. John tells him that killing John would directly violate that mission. The Terminator freezes. His systems struggle between the TX's command and his original programming. Finally, he regains control. Instead of attacking John, he turns toward a nearby vehicle and destroys it in a violent burst of rage. John immediately gets Kate and heads for the aircraft. The T-850 stays behind as his systems shut down again. John and Kate take off without him. Their only goal now is to reach the location Robert gave them before the nuclear attack begins. They eventually arrive at the secure government site and land nearby. The place appears completely abandoned. John and Kate enter cautiously. John even fires a weapon to see whether anyone responds. Nothing happens. They move farther inside and begin searching the computers. Then a helicopter suddenly crashes through the building. The TX emerges from the wreckage. She has survived again. John and Kate run as she comes after them. Before the TX can reach them, another helicopter crashes into the facility. The second impact knocks her back. Then John sees who caused it. The T-850 has returned. He managed to restart himself and follow them. John and Kate race toward enormous security doors leading underground, but the doors begin closing before they can pass through. The T-850 reaches the mechanism and uses his strength to hold the doors open. John and Kate crawl beneath them. Then the TX arrives and grabs John before the entrance can fully close. The T-850 pulls him free and locks onto the TX, holding her back while the humans escape inside. He knows he cannot defeat her through strength alone, so he uses his final option. The T-850 removes one of his remaining explosive power components and forces it into the TX. He keeps her trapped beside him. John realizes what the Terminator is doing. Seconds later, the device explodes. The blast destroys both machines and seals John and Kate safely inside the underground facility. With the TX finally gone, they continue deeper into the shelter. They expect to find Skynet's central system. Instead, there is nothing. No master computer. No servers controlling the network. Nothing they can destroy. John becomes furious. After everything they sacrificed, they still failed to reach Skynet. Then Kate understands what her father actually did. He never sent them there to destroy Skynet. He sent them there because the location was a protected government bunker. The T-850 knew the truth as well. Judgment Day could no longer be stopped. Their mission was never to prevent it. It was to survive it. John finally understands why they were brought there. Moments later, voices begin coming through the communication system. Military personnel from different locations are calling for help, asking whether anyone is still in command. John looks at the microphone. The future he spent years running from has finally reached him. He answers the call. Kate stands beside him and takes his hand. Above ground, nuclear missiles launch across the world. Cities are consumed by explosions as millions die and civilization collapses. Judgment Day has arrived. John Connor could not prevent the war, but he and Kate have survived long enough. The biggest problem Terminator 3, Rise of the Machines, has is honestly not even something the movie created for itself. It came after the Terminator and Terminator 2. That is a brutal position for any sequel to be in. The first film had that lean, almost horror movie energy. It was simple, dark, relentless. Then Terminator 2 came along and somehow took that same idea, made everything bigger, gave it more emotion, more spectacle, better action, and still kept the story under control. So by the time a third movie showed up, audiences weren't just expecting another decent sci-fi action film. They were comparing it to two movies that had already defined what this franchise could be. And that comparison hurts T3 almost immediately, because judged on its own, there is quite a lot here that works. It's fast, expensive, entertaining. Arnold is back. There are huge set pieces, and the movie understands that people came to see Terminators smash through things. As a summer blockbuster, it's actually pretty easy to enjoy, but then you remember T2. That's where the problem starts. The second movie didn't just give us bigger action. It felt like the franchise was evolving. The characters changed. The relationship between John and the Terminator mattered. Sarah Connor had become almost unrecognizable from the woman we met in the first film, but in a way that made complete sense. Even the villain felt like something audiences genuinely hadn't seen before. T3, by comparison, feels much more like a continuation of a machine that was already running. There's a new Terminator. There's another Protector. John Connor is being hunted again. There's another race against Judgment Day. There are bigger vehicles, bigger explosions, more destruction, but the basic engine is very familiar. And I think that's why reactions to this movie are so divided. If you go into Terminator 3 expecting it to reinvent the series the way T2 did, you're probably going to come away disappointed. It doesn't have that same sense of discovery. It doesn't feel like cinema suddenly jumping forward, but if you approach it as basically one more ride in this universe, it plays a lot better. That's also why I think some of the criticism around this movie can be a little unfair. Very few sequels could realistically follow Terminator 2 and come out looking superior. That movie set an absurd standard. So saying T3 isn't as good as T2 is true, but it only tells you so much. The more important question is whether T3 gives you enough reason to come back, and that's where I'm more conflicted. Because there are moments where it absolutely does. The action has weight. Arnold still has presence. The movie moves. It can be funny. It has a darker ending than you might expect from something this glossy and commercial. But there are also long stretches where it feels like the filmmakers are servicing the franchise instead of pushing it somewhere genuinely new. And by the third film, that starts to matter. We've already seen a Terminator sent back through time. We've already seen a more advanced machine hunting the heroes. We've already seen the chase through modern-day America. So just making the new machine stronger or the explosions bigger isn't automatically enough. That's probably the real burden T3 carries. The first two films had already taken the central idea surprisingly far, so the third movie needed either a completely fresh angle or it needed to go somewhere the previous films had only teased. And one obvious possibility was the future war. Those brief glimpses of ruined cities, machines moving through the darkness, resistance fighters trying to survive, that world had always been sitting there in the background. By the time of a third film, you can understand why some viewers wanted the story to finally move forward instead of once again sending everybody back into another present-day chase. Instead, T3 stays with the familiar structure. That makes it accessible. It also makes it feel safe. And then there is James Cameron's absence. Jonathan Mostow is a capable action director. I don't think the movie falls apart simply because Cameron isn't behind the camera. In fact, some of the action is handled very well. But what becomes noticeable is that Cameron's contribution to the first two films wasn't just spectacle. It was the way the spectacle was tied to character. The action in Titwo worked because you cared about John. You cared about Sarah. You even started caring about a machine. There was this emotional current underneath all the gunfire and metal. T3 can reproduce a lot of the surface elements, the leather, the weapons, the chases, the Terminator mythology, but it doesn't always reproduce that emotional weight. And that's really what keeps it in the shadow of the earlier films. Still, I don't think Rise of the Machines deserves to be dismissed completely. There's a difference between being a disappointing sequel to two classics and being a bad movie. T3 is not Terminator 2. It was probably never going to be. It doesn't redefine the genre, and it doesn't give the franchise another giant leap forward. But as a loud, fast, slightly ridiculous sci-fi action movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger walking back into one of his most iconic roles, it has enough energy to justify the watch. The problem is that every time it starts to feel really good, there's this little voice in the back of your head reminding you what came before. And against the Terminator and Terminator 2, really good was always going to feel a little smaller. The basic story in Terminator 3 is pretty easy to recognize if you've seen the first two movies. John Connor is being hunted again. A more advanced Terminator has been sent back through time to kill him and other people who will matter in the future. And once again, another Schwarzenegger model Terminator arrives to keep him alive. So right away, the movie is working with a structure we've already seen. That's not automatically a bad thing. Franchises repeat formulas all the time, and sometimes that familiarity is part of the fun. The problem here is that T3 doesn't always find enough new material inside that formula to make it feel fresh. The TX is basically the next escalation. The T-1000 was more advanced than Arnold's Terminator in Titwo, so now we need something even more advanced. She can change appearance, access technology, control machines, turn her arm into weapons. Basically, the movie keeps adding abilities because that's what a third film is expected to do. Bigger threat, more weapons, more destruction. But the actual dramatic setup is still very close to what we've already watched. A killer machine arrives, a protector arrives, everybody starts running, and then we're back in another extended chase toward Judgment Day. For me, that's where the movie starts feeling less like the next chapter and more like another variation of the previous chapter. There are some changes, obviously. John is older now. He's living completely off the grid. Sarah is gone. Kate Brewster is brought into the story, and through her father, we get a new connection to the military systems surrounding Skynet. The TX isn't only looking for John either. She's hunting people who are supposed to become important members of the future resistance. That part is actually a decent idea. If John Connor can't be located because he's removed himself from the system, then Skynet starts going after the people around him instead. It gives the mission a slightly different shape, but then John and Kate just happen to cross paths at the veterinary clinic, and that's where you can almost feel the screenplay arranging pieces on the board. It's convenient, very convenient. And once we learn Kate isn't just some random person from John's past, but someone who is incredibly important to his future, the coincidence becomes even harder to ignore. Now, depending on how forgiving you are with time travel movies, maybe you just accept it. This franchise has always relied on people from different timelines arriving at exactly the right moments. You kind of have to give the story some room, but T3 keeps asking for that room, and that's where the time travel logic starts getting messy, because Terminator 2 gave us something that felt like a real conclusion. Cyberdyne was destroyed. The work that was supposed to lead to Skynet was wiped out. Sarah, John, and the Terminator went through all of that because they believed the future could be changed. Then T3 comes along and basically says, well, not exactly. Judgment Day is still coming. Skynet is still coming. Maybe you delayed it, but you didn't stop it. Now, dramatically, that's a pretty bold direction. We'll get into the philosophical side of that later. But from a continuity standpoint, it creates a bunch of questions. If the destruction of Cyberdyne didn't really prevent Skynet, then how exactly did Skynet develop this time? How much did the events of Titwo actually change? And if the future can keep reorganizing itself around whatever the characters do, then at what point does the whole time travel structure become impossible to pin down? That's the danger with these stories. The first movie gives you one timeline problem. The second movie complicates it. By the third movie, you're not just continuing the story anymore. You're explaining why the previous ending didn't actually end anything. And T3 doesn't always do that cleanly. There are smaller continuity issues too. The Terminator Arnold plays here is not the same machine from Titwo. The movie makes that clear. It's another unit from the same line, a different machine entirely. Fine, but then there are moments where he behaves in ways that seem suspiciously connected to what the previous Terminator learned. One example raised by the material is his avoidance of killing humans. In Titwo, that behavior made sense because John specifically taught the Terminator not to kill people. That was part of their relationship. It wasn't just a default personality setting, but this Terminator arrives already operating with similar restraint. You can probably invent an explanation for it. Maybe he was programmed that way before being sent back. Maybe future Kate gave him different instructions. Maybe the Resistance changed something. The movie just doesn't spend much time making those details feel airtight. There's also the strange situation where this supposedly different Terminator occasionally seems to perform learned behaviors associated with the previous one. Again, these are not necessarily huge problems individually. They're the kind of things you can ignore while the movie is moving. And fortunately for T3, it moves a lot. That's actually one of the screenplay's survival mechanisms. If the characters are running, fighting, driving, crashing through buildings, or trying to stop the next disaster, you don't have much time to sit there and diagram the timeline. But once you do, yeah, things start wobbling. And I think that's why some viewers are much harder on the story than others. If you treat the plot mainly as a delivery system for the action, it works reasonably well. John and Kate need to get somewhere. The TX is coming. Arnold has to stop her. Keep moving. Simple. Effective enough. But if you're really invested in the mythology of the first two films, the screenplay becomes much more frustrating because every new explanation has consequences for what came before. That's the bigger issue. It's not just that T3 repeats the plot structure. It's that repeating it requires the movie to reopen questions that Titwo had already answered. The sequel needs Judgment Day back on the table because otherwise there's no movie. It needs another killer Terminator because that's the central franchise image. It needs another protector because Arnold has to return. It needs John Connor in danger again because he's still the center of the mythology. And once you see all those requirements sitting there, you start noticing the machinery behind the story. That's never ideal. You want a sequel to feel like events naturally demanded another chapter. T3 sometimes feels like another chapter was demanded first, and then the story had to figure out how to make that possible. Still, I wouldn't say the plot is incomprehensible. It isn't. The movie gives you enough information to follow what's happening, and the central objective is always clear. You know who is being hunted. You know who's protecting them. You understand what's at stake. It's just not especially elegant, and maybe that's the best way to describe the writing here. Functional, sometimes clever, occasionally interesting, but constantly fighting against the fact that the franchise had already used its strongest version of this exact structure. So while Terminator 3 keeps the story moving, it never completely escapes the feeling that we've been down this road before. Only this time the machines have more upgrades, and the timeline has more problems. One of the more interesting things Terminator 3 does is show us a John Connor who looks nothing like the legendary resistance leader we've been hearing about for 2 movies. He's not commanding troops, he's not giving speeches, he's not even really functioning like a normal adult. He's hiding. John has basically removed himself from society. No stable job, no permanent address, no real paper trail. He wants to be invisible because, from his point of view, being invisible is probably the only reason he's still alive, and that actually makes sense. This is someone who grew up being told that the world was going to end, that machines were going to wipe out most of humanity, and that somehow he would eventually be responsible for leading the survivors. Try living a normal life after that. so there's something genuinely sad about where T3 finds him. John knows who he's supposed to become, but he hasn't become that person yet. He's stuck in this weird space between an ordinary young man and a future myth, and the future he's waiting for is horrible. That's the cruel part. For John Connor to become the great leader everyone keeps talking about, Judgment Day has to happen first. Millions of people have to die, civilization has to collapse, so what exactly is he supposed to hope for? That's probably the strongest idea attached to the character in this movie. His destiny isn't empowering anymore, it's hanging over him. You can see why he's withdrawn, nervous, even a little lost. The problem is that what works on paper doesn't always work on screen. Nick Stahl has a very difficult job here because he's taking over a character that audiences already know, and he's supposed to convince us that this scared, uncertain drifter will eventually become the man who leads humanity against Skynet. And for some people, that leap is just too big. There are scenes where Stahl feels appropriately damaged and uneasy. You can buy that this guy has spent years looking over his shoulder, waiting for something terrible to happen. But there are other moments where John just feels too passive, too unsure of himself. And when the entire mythology keeps telling us this man is going to become the leader of the human resistance, you naturally start looking for some hint of that person. Sometimes it's there, sometimes not really. That's where Kate Brewster becomes interesting, because she often seems more put together than John does. Claire Danes gives Kate a kind of practical toughness. She's confused by what's happening, obviously, but once the situation becomes real, she adapts pretty quickly. At times she actually seems more capable than John, and that's a strange dynamic for this franchise. John is supposed to be the important one, the future leader, the person history is apparently built around, yet Kate is often the one who feels more grounded, more decisive, more emotionally stable. Depending on how you look at it, that's either a nice bit of character contrast or another sign that the movie doesn't quite know how to sell John Connor as the man he's supposed to become. Danes also has the advantage of feeling more natural in the dramatic moments. Even when the writing doesn't give Kate much depth, she usually finds something believable to play. The character itself isn't always as strong. There are points where Kate feels like she's there, because the plot needs another person connected to the future. Then we learn she's not just some random woman John knew years ago. She's going to become important to him later. Very important, and once that information arrives, you can feel the screenplay trying to give her a larger place in the mythology. It works to a point, but it can also feel a little convenient. Still, I think the bigger issue with both John and Kate is not really about either actor. It's about what's missing around them. The first two Terminator movies had strong human relationships at their center. The original had Sarah Connor being dragged into a nightmare she didn't understand. Then Titwo had Sarah and John, John and the Terminator, Sarah and the machine she absolutely could not trust. Those relationships gave the action something to sit on. You weren't just watching people run from a robot. You cared about who these people were becoming while they were running. That's harder to find in T3. John and Kate have history, but the emotional connection between them never feels as powerful as the relationships in the earlier films. And then there's Sarah Connor. Her absence is huge. The movie does explain what happened to her, and I don't think it handles that badly. Her influence is still everywhere, especially in John. But Linda Hamilton brought so much intensity to this series that removing Sarah inevitably changes the emotional temperature. Kate is not Sarah Connor, and to be fair, she shouldn't be, but the movie still needs someone to fill that emotional space. It never quite finds an equivalent. That's why T3 can have bigger action, newer machines, more destruction, and still somehow feel smaller on a human level. The characters are there, the performances are mostly fine. There are even some good ideas, especially with John, but the connection isn't as strong. And in a franchise this cold and mechanical, that human connection matters more than you might think. Because the machines were never really the reason these movies worked. The machines were the threat. The people were the reason you cared. Arnold Schwarzenegger is still the easiest part of Terminator 3 to enjoy. That sounds obvious, but it matters, because this movie asks him to carry a lot more than just the action. By this point, the Terminator image is basically built into pop culture. The leather, the weapons, the deadpan delivery, the one-liners. You already know the routine before he even arrives, and somehow he still makes it work. He doesn't need much dialogue to establish the character. He walks into a scene, looks completely unbothered by whatever chaos is happening around him, says something ridiculous with total seriousness, and suddenly the movie has a little more energy. That's Arnold's real advantage here. He knows exactly what this role is. He's not trying to turn the T-850 into some huge dramatic showcase. He understands that the character works through physical presence, timing, and that strange robotic seriousness he's always been so good at. Give him a massive weapon, put him in the middle of a collapsing building, let him throw out a one-liner, and he's completely at home. Even when the material around him gets shaky, he rarely does, but there's something different this time. Arnold is older, you can see it, and instead of pretending that doesn't matter, the movie accidentally finds something interesting in it. This Terminator isn't the newest machine anymore. He's obsolete. He's facing the TX, a model that's faster, more advanced, more adaptable, and generally better equipped. The old Terminator, who once looked almost unstoppable, is now getting thrown around by something newer. And that creates this strange parallel between the character and Schwarzenegger himself. You've got an aging action star playing an aging machine, not literally aging in the human sense, obviously, but outdated, superseded, built for a different generation. I actually like that more than I expected to. Because suddenly Arnold looking a little older isn't necessarily a weakness. It almost becomes part of the character. The T-850 moves like older hardware. He's strong, durable, experienced, but he's not cutting edge anymore, and the movie knows it. There are moments where the TX absolutely handles him. She throws him through walls. She outmaneuvers him. She has weapons built into her body. She can interact with technology in ways he simply can't. He's the old model trying to keep up. That's kind of fun. It also gives the fights a different dynamic from T-2. Back then, Arnold was technically outmatched too, but here the gap feels even more obvious. The T-850 is almost this stubborn piece of machinery that keeps getting back up because that's what it was built to do. And honestly, that fits Schwarzenegger perfectly. He's never been the kind of screen presence that feels fragile. Even when the character is being destroyed, there's still this sense that he'll stand up again somehow. But here's where I think T3 loses something important. The Terminator in T2 became more than a machine, not because he suddenly turned human, but because his relationship with John changed how we saw him. The whole movie gradually built that connection. John was teaching him behavior, language, restraint, even a rough understanding of why humans act the way they do. By the end, that machine actually mattered emotionally. The T-850 in T3 doesn't really get that. He has a job: protect John, protect Kate, get them where they need to go, and that's pretty much the relationship. There are moments of humor and a few bits of tension between them, but nothing with the same emotional pull as John and the Terminator in the second film. So Arnold is still entertaining, but the character itself feels thinner. More functional, he's basically the world's most indestructible bodyguard, and that's fine for an action movie. It just feels like a step backward for a series that had already proved this character could be more interesting than that. The movie seems aware of this too, because it leans harder into comedy. Arnold gets to mock the image. The clothing scene is played as a joke. The sunglasses moment is a joke. Some of the dialogue is knowingly corny. Sometimes it lands. Sometimes it really doesn't. But I do think Schwarzenegger's willingness to make fun of the character helps the movie. He doesn't act like the Terminator is sacred. And by the third film, that's probably a smart choice. The audience already knows every gesture, every expression, every pause before the punchline. So rather than pretending we're seeing this for the first time, the movie lets Arnold play around with it. There's also something weirdly appropriate about watching this supposedly outdated machine refusing to disappear, because that's basically what Arnold is doing in the movie too. The action genre had changed. Special effects had changed. Younger stars were coming through. The blockbuster landscape was moving on. And here's Schwarzenegger, still standing in the middle of it, still holding a ridiculous gun, still completely believable as the guy who can survive being driven through a building. That's part of why he remains the film's biggest asset. You may not completely buy Nick Stahl as the future leader of humanity. You may not find the TX as memorable as the T-1000. You may have problems with the story, but when Arnold is on screen, Terminator 3 usually feels like a Terminator movie. That's not nothing. At the same time, you can feel the limits of relying on that familiarity. The performance works because we've seen it before. The jokes work because we've seen it before. The entire visual identity works because we've seen it before. And eventually that becomes the question hanging over Arnold's return. Is this still iconic, or are we just comfortable? Probably a little of both. But if Terminator 3 is the story of an older machine trying to prove it still has a place in a newer world, Schwarzenegger is almost too perfect for it. The character may be outdated, the actor may be older, but when the movie needs someone to walk into chaos and make the whole thing feel bigger, Arnold still does the job. Creating a new Terminator villain after the T-1000 was always going to be a problem. Robert Patrick's machine in Terminator 2 was such a clean idea. He looked ordinary, almost harmless, and then suddenly he could turn his body into weapons, walk through impossible damage, and keep coming after you without ever looking tired. So when Terminator 3 introduces the TX, the obvious question is, how do you top that? The movie's answer is basically to give her more of everything. She's faster, more heavily armed. She can change her appearance, control other machines, interact with computer systems, and turn her arms into different weapons. On paper, she's ridiculous, in a good way. You look at the list of abilities and think, okay, Arnold is in serious trouble here. And Kristanna Loken does understand the physical side of the character. She's very controlled, very still, she doesn't overplay anything. Most of the time she has this blank, almost clinical expression that works well for a machine that doesn't need to explain itself. She doesn't say much either, which is probably the right choice. A Terminator usually gets more threatening the less it talks. There are also moments where the TX genuinely feels dangerous, especially when she starts using the technology around her instead of just chasing people on foot. That's one thing this movie does differently. The TX doesn't just have a stronger body, she can manipulate machines around her. That gives the character a wider reach. Suddenly, a normal vehicle or piece of technology can become part of the threat. That's actually a smart evolution of the idea. The problem is that being more advanced doesn't automatically make her more memorable, and this is where the comparison with the T-1000 becomes unavoidable. The T-1000 wasn't terrifying because the movie kept telling us how many features he had. He was terrifying because he never stopped. He had this simple, relentless quality. No jokes, no distractions. No personality beyond the mission. He just kept moving toward John. The TX has more abilities, but somehow she doesn't always create the same pressure. That's strange. You'd think the more powerful machine would automatically feel more dangerous, but that's not really how movie villains work. Threat is about presence. It's about how the film uses the character. And sometimes the TX feels more like a collection of cool ideas than a truly frightening enemy. There are scenes where she gets very close to John and Kate, fails to finish them, disappears for a while, then comes back for the next action sequence. After a while, that starts to weaken the whole unstoppable machine thing, because if she's supposed to be this ultimate killing system, you start wondering why these two normal people keep surviving. Obviously, the movie needs them alive, but you can feel the screenplay protecting them. And once you notice that, the villain becomes less intimidating. There's also the visual design. The movie clearly wants the contrast. Arnold is this huge, old-school machine. The TX is sleek, younger, more modern, more polished. And making the new Terminator female gives the film a different visual dynamic. That's fine. But some reviewers felt the movie leaned too much on Loken's attractiveness and not enough on making the character genuinely disturbing. I can see that. The TX looks cool. She's composed. She's stylish. But cool and scary aren't always the same thing. Robert Patrick could look completely normal and still make a scene uncomfortable. With Loken, you're often watching the character's abilities. With Patrick, you were watching the character. There's a difference. That doesn't mean Loken gives a bad performance. I actually think she does what the role asks. She keeps the movements clean, the expressions minimal, and the voice controlled. The bigger issue is the writing around her. The movie keeps trying to prove she's better than the previous model by adding upgrades, built-in weapons, machine control. More strength, more durability, more technology. But every extra feature also makes the character feel a little more designed. You can almost imagine someone in a production meeting saying, okay, what can this Terminator do that the last one couldn't? And that's a very sequel kind of problem. Instead of asking what would make the villain more frightening, you start asking what would make the villain more advanced. Those are not the same question. Still, the TX does create one thing I really like. She makes Arnold feel vulnerable. Not emotionally vulnerable, physically. The T-850 is clearly outclassed. When they fight, you can see that he's dealing with a machine from another generation. She throws him around. She has more options. She can adapt faster, and that gives their confrontation some energy because Arnold is no longer the biggest threat in the room. The bathroom fight is probably one of the better examples. It's heavy, stupid, destructive fun. Two machines basically using the room as a weapon against each other. That's where the TX works best. Not when the movie is explaining what she can do, when she's actually doing it, and maybe that's the fairest way to look at the character. She's a good action villain, she's visually distinct, she gives the movie some entertaining fights. Loken brings the right physical control, but she never quite becomes that nightmare you can't forget. The T-1000 felt like something impossible. The TX feels like an upgrade, and that tells you a lot about Terminator 3 in general. The movie keeps trying to go bigger, newer machine, more weapons, more destruction. More abilities, but bigger isn't always better. Sometimes the simpler idea is the one that gets under your skin, and for all the things the TX can do, that's the one thing she never completely manages. If there is one area where Terminator 3 usually gets the job done, it's the action. Even people who don't particularly like the movie tend to admit that it knows how to destroy things. Cars get crushed, buildings get torn apart, machines get thrown through walls, guns are huge, explosions are constant, and the movie rarely goes very long without finding another excuse to put something expensive in danger. And honestly, some of it is great fun. The crane chase is the obvious highlight. That sequence is completely excessive, but in exactly the way a movie like this should be excessive. You've got this enormous crane tearing through traffic, smashing vehicles, ripping into buildings, and dragging Arnold through what feels like half the city. It's ridiculous, but it's also the kind of ridiculous that works because so much of it has real physical weight. You feel the machinery, you feel the impact. You can actually see vehicles being destroyed instead of everything turning into weightless digital debris. That matters. A lot of modern action can look technically impressive and still feel oddly soft. Here, when something gets hit, it looks like it got hit. The fire truck chase has some of that same energy, so does the cemetery escape. And the fight between the T-850 and the TX in the bathroom is basically two indestructible machines deciding that furniture, walls, and plumbing are optional. There's not much elegance to it. They're just smashing the place apart, and I mean that as a compliment. The action works best when the movie stops trying to be clever and just lets these two machines behave like machines. But there is a downside. There is a lot of action. Maybe too much. At some point, the movie starts running into the problem where every chase has to be louder than the one before it. You get a pursuit, then another escape, then another confrontation. And after a while, the spectacle starts eating its own impact. If everything is big, nothing feels quite as big anymore. That's the weird thing about T3. It is constantly moving, but it doesn't always feel tense. Those are two different things. A movie can have explosions every 5 minutes and still not create suspense. The first two Terminator films understood that pretty well. They knew when to slow down. They let the threat sit in the room for a while. You could feel the Terminator getting closer before anything actually happened. T3 is much more impatient. It often wants to get to the next crash. That makes the movie easy to watch, but it also means some of the menace disappears. And the pacing is kind of strange because different sections work for different people. Some viewers find the opening slow. Others think the first 30 minutes are actually the best part of the movie. I can see both arguments. The early setup does spend time getting John and Kate into position, but once the crane sequence kicks in, the movie suddenly wakes up. That's probably why that chase stands out so much. It feels like the point where T3 finally says, okay, this is what we're here for. Then the problem becomes maintaining that level, and it doesn't always. There are later sequences with plenty of destruction, but not all of them have the same rhythm or physical excitement. The movie keeps increasing the amount of action without necessarily increasing the tension. By the end, you may not be bored. You might actually be exhausted. Visually, though, the movie still looks expensive. That's important because nothing about Terminator 3 feels cheap. The photography is polished, the editing is clean, the scale is obvious. This was clearly built as a major studio blockbuster, and for the most part it looks like one. The visual effects are a little more complicated. Some of the CGI is solid, some of it has aged. And even at the time, there was always going to be a problem, because Terminator 2 had already made special effects part of movie history. That's an unfair comparison, but it's unavoidable. The T-1000 felt revolutionary. People hadn't seen that kind of effect used that way before. By the time T3 arrives, digital effects are everywhere. So even when the technology is more advanced, the sense of discovery is gone. That's why I think the practical stuff often plays better. Watching a real vehicle slam into something has a texture that CGI sometimes can't fake. The crane sequence understands that. The stunt work understands that. The explosions understand that. You don't have to wonder whether something has weight because you're looking at weight. And that gives the movie a kind of old-school action appeal even though it's filled with digital effects. Jonathan Mostow deserves some credit here too. He may not bring the same overall vision James Cameron brought to the earlier films, but when it comes to staging destruction, he knows what he's doing. The action is usually easy to follow. You know where the characters are. You know what is chasing them. You know what just exploded. That sounds basic, but plenty of action movies fail at it. Mostow doesn't. He keeps the sequences clear enough that the chaos actually registers. And I think that's really where Terminator 3 succeeds as a blockbuster. It's not revolutionary. It's not showing you the future of cinema. It's not trying to reinvent what action movies can be. It just wants to put a lot of money on screen and make sure you can see where it went. Most of the time, you can. The strange part is that the movie's biggest strength also exposes one of its biggest weaknesses. The action is good enough that you start wishing the story around it had the same confidence. Because when that crane starts tearing through the street, T3 feels alive. When the machines are fighting, the movie knows exactly what it wants to be. It's when everything slows down and the screenplay has to carry the weight that you start noticing the difference. Still, if you came to Rise of the Machines for large-scale destruction, practical stunt work, huge chases and Arnold getting launched through walls, the movie delivers. Maybe not with the innovation of T2, but with enough force that for a while you stop caring. One of the biggest changes in Terminator 3 is the tone. This movie is much more willing to joke around. Sometimes that works, sometimes it really doesn't. The earlier films had humor too, especially T2, but the comedy usually came out of character. John teaching the Terminator how to behave, the awkward one-liners, the machine trying to understand people. It fit naturally into the story. T3 pushes that side much harder. You can feel the movie looking at the franchise and saying, everybody already knows these images, so why not have some fun with them? The best example is Arnold's entrance. In the earlier movie, the Terminator walks into a biker bar, takes some clothes, grabs the sunglasses, and suddenly you've got one of the most iconic action movie introductions ever. T3 basically turns that memory into a punchline. This time he ends up in a strip club. The clothes aren't exactly what you'd expect. The sunglasses gag gets flipped, and the whole thing is played with this very deliberate self-awareness. I actually think that scene works, not because it's subtle. It isn't. It works because Arnold commits to it completely. He never plays the joke. That's important. The situation is ridiculous, but his face stays dead serious. And that contrast is still funny. A lot of the humor in T3 depends on that. Arnold saying something cheesy like it's the most logical statement in the world. That has always been part of his appeal in these movies. The problem is that the script starts leaning on it too much. There are lines here that feel less like something the Terminator would naturally say, and more like the writers trying very hard to create the next catchphrase. Talk to the hand is probably the obvious example. Some people find it funny. For others, that's the exact moment where the movie crosses the line from self-aware to embarrassing. And I get both reactions. In the right mood, it's dumb fun. But if you're comparing this movie to the colder, more threatening atmosphere of the first two, those jokes can feel like they're constantly letting the air out of the room. That's the bigger issue with the comedy. It's not just whether the jokes are funny. It's what they do to the tension. A Terminator movie works best when there is this feeling that something terrible is always getting closer. T3 often interrupts that feeling with a wink. Sometimes it's a callback. Sometimes it's a one-liner. Sometimes it's just a scene designed to remind you that the movie knows how ridiculous all of this is. And after a while, the danger doesn't feel quite as dangerous. The TX can be chasing everyone through the city. Arnold can be smashing through walls. Judgment Day can be hanging over the whole story. And then the movie wants to make sure you get the joke. That's a difficult balance. I don't think the lighter tone destroys the film. Actually, part of me understands why they went this way. By the third movie, the Terminator image had become incredibly familiar. The leather jacket, the sunglasses, the robotic one-liners, the slow walk, the huge weapons. You can't really present all of that with exactly the same seriousness forever. At some point, the movie either has to change the formula or acknowledge the fact that people know the formula. T3 chooses acknowledgement, and sometimes that gives the movie a nice, relaxed energy. It doesn't act like every moment is sacred. It doesn't treat the franchise like some untouchable mythology. There is something refreshing about that, but there's also a risk. Once a franchise starts parodying its own most famous moments, you start wondering whether it still believes in them. That's where the self-parody becomes a little dangerous. Are we laughing because the movie has found a clever new angle? Or are we laughing because the old ideas have become too familiar to play straight? That question hangs over a lot of the humor. The same thing happens with the dialogue. There are still some lines that land because Arnold knows exactly how to deliver them. He can make a mediocre line sound better just by pausing before it. But outside of Arnold, the script is often much less memorable. Some of the dialogue is pretty basic, some of it is cliché. And there are moments where characters are explaining things rather than actually talking like people. That's a noticeable drop when you compare it to the earlier films, where even the exposition usually had some tension or personality behind it. Here, the story occasionally stops so someone can explain the next piece of mythology. And because the movie is moving so quickly, the dialogue can feel like connective tissue between action scenes. That's not always a problem in a blockbuster. But in a Terminator movie, it stands out because the earlier films gave you memorable character moments between the explosions. There's also Dr. Silberman's return. It's basically a callback, a familiar face. A joke for people who remember the earlier movies, and that's pretty much the function. Again, I don't hate it. It's fun seeing him, but it also shows how much T3 depends on recognition. You remember this character. You remember this setup. You remember this line. You remember this visual. The movie keeps reaching back, and that can be entertaining. Nostalgia works for a reason, but it also reinforces the feeling that T3 doesn't have quite as much new material of its own. That's probably the strange thing about the tone. The comedy makes the movie easier to enjoy in the moment. It gives Arnold more personality. It keeps the film from becoming too heavy. And for some viewers, that's exactly why T3 works as a summer blockbuster. It's big, loud, self-aware, and not afraid to be a little stupid. But for other viewers, that same choice is one of the reasons the movie feels less like Terminator. The darkness is still there, the apocalypse is still there, the idea of Judgment Day is still serious, but the movie doesn't sit in that dread for very long. It keeps cracking the tension, and once that happens enough times, the atmosphere changes. So I don't think the problem is that Terminator 3 has humor. The first two movies had humor. The problem is that T3 sometimes seems more interested in reminding you that it knows it's a Terminator movie than in making you forget you're watching one. When the jokes come naturally, Arnold is still funny. When the movie starts chasing laughs, you can feel it, and that difference pretty much defines the whole tonal shift. The ending of Terminator 3 is probably the one thing in the movie that almost everyone remembers, and that's interesting because for most of the runtime, the film feels pretty safe. Familiar setup, familiar chase structure, familiar character dynamics. Then the last stretch gets surprisingly dark. John and Kate spend the movie believing they can still stop Judgment Day. That's what this franchise has trained us to expect. Find the source, reach the facility, shut something down, change the future. That's the mission. So when the film starts pointing them toward what looks like one final chance to prevent everything, you naturally assume that's where it's going, and then it doesn't. That's what makes the ending work. The movie essentially pulls the rug out from under John, Kate, and the audience at the same time. They haven't been sent somewhere to stop Judgment Day. They've been sent somewhere to survive it. That's a very different idea. Suddenly, the entire movie changes shape in the last few minutes. John isn't being guided toward another heroic victory. He's being positioned to become the person everyone has been telling him he'll become. And the horrible part is that this can only happen after the world ends. There's something genuinely bleak about that. For two movies, John Connor's future leadership has sounded almost heroic. He's the guy who saves humanity. He's the one who organizes the resistance. He's the reason the machines are afraid enough to start sending Terminators into the past. But T3 finally asks what has to happen before that version of John can exist. The answer is basically, everything has to go wrong. That's where the ending lands. Judgment Day happens. Not because John failed to try. Not because he made one stupid mistake. It happens because, according to this movie, it was always coming. And that's where the ending becomes really divisive. Because on one level, I think it's one of the bravest things Terminator 3 does. This is a massive studio action movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger, giant explosions, one-liners, car chases. And then it ends by saying, no, you don't get to save the world this time. That's unusual. It doesn't give you that clean victory where the heroes blow up the right computer and walk away while the music swells. It leaves John and Kate sitting there as civilization begins collapsing around them. That's a strong image. And honestly, it gives the title Rise of the Machines some actual meaning. The machines really do rise. The movie doesn't dodge it. But then you have the other side of this, and it's a big one. The first two Terminator movies built so much of their identity around the idea that the future wasn't fixed, that human beings could change it. That destiny wasn't some locked track you were forced to follow. Sarah Connor's entire transformation is built around that belief. She doesn't accept the future. She fights it. She changes herself because she believes action matters. And Terminator 2 takes that even further. Sarah, John, and the Terminator destroy Cyberdyne because they believe they can stop Judgment Day from happening. Then T3 comes along and says, well, you delayed it, that's it. You bought some time, and depending on how invested you are in the philosophy of the earlier movies, that can feel either incredibly bold or incredibly frustrating. Because if Judgment Day was always inevitable, what exactly did Sarah accomplish? What did destroying Cyberdyne really change? Was all that sacrifice just a temporary delay? That's not a small question. It changes how you look back at the second film. And I think that's why some people really hate what T3 does here. It doesn't just create a new ending for this movie. It reaches backward and changes the meaning of the previous one. Instead of the future is what we make it, the message starts becoming something closer to, some things are going to happen no matter what you do. That's a much darker worldview, maybe even a more cynical one. And weirdly, I think that's also why the ending is so much more interesting than most of the movie leading up to it. because finally, T3 takes a real risk. For most of the film, it's following familiar tracks. New Terminator. Old Terminator, John Connor, car chase, explosion, run. Then, right at the end, it actually challenges one of the basic assumptions of the series. You can argue whether that challenge is good or bad, but at least it's doing something. And the final moments with John are especially important. Earlier in the movie, he's lost. He's hiding from his own future. He doesn't look like a leader. He doesn't sound like one. Half the time, he doesn't even seem to believe he's capable of becoming one. Then the world starts falling apart. The radio comes alive, and people start looking for someone to tell them what to do. And John answers. It's not some huge transformation scene. No giant speech. No dramatic costume change. Just a small moment where he finally steps into the role that has been waiting for him. That works, maybe more than it should. Because suddenly the scared, drifting John Connor makes sense. He wasn't supposed to become the leader before Judgment Day. Judgment Day is what creates the circumstances that force him to become one. That's tragic, but dramatically it clicks. And it also points the franchise towards something different. For years we've been hearing about the future war. We've seen flashes of it. Ruined cities, machines hunting survivors, human resistance fighters barely holding on. T3 finally ends at the point where that future can begin, which almost makes you wish the movie had gotten there sooner. Because by the time the credits roll, you're suddenly looking at a version of the story that feels fresher than the repeated chase we've just spent most of the movie watching. And that's kind of the strange legacy of Terminator 3. Its ending suggests a much more interesting movie than a lot of what comes before it. So where does that leave the film overall? Somewhere in the middle, honestly. It's nowhere near the first two movies. I don't think that's controversial. It doesn't have the same sense of invention. It doesn't have the same character depth. The villain isn't as memorable. The humor is shakier. The story repeats too much of what we've already seen, and the time travel logic gets increasingly messy the more you think about it. But it's also not the disaster it's sometimes remembered as. The action is good, sometimes really good. Arnold is still entertaining. Claire Danes does solid work. There are some interesting ideas with John Connor. The TX has a few fun concepts behind her. Jonathan Mostow knows how to stage a blockbuster. And that ending has more nerve than I remembered. That's probably the fairest way to look at Rise of the Machines. It isn't another Terminator 2. It was never going to be. But buried inside this very conventional sequel is a surprisingly bleak idea about destiny. The first two films told us to fight the future. T3 asks what happens when the future fights back and wins. I'm not completely convinced that it's the right direction for the mythology, but as an ending, it sticks with you. And for a movie that spends so much time recycling what came before, finishing on something genuinely uncomfortable is probably the most Terminator 3 thing it could have done.